I would love to know how you got started in showing dogs.
Well, my parents bred Irish setters, and we bought our first Irish setter. I was about 5, I think, when we bought our first Irish setter, and she wasn't very good quality, but she was passable. And we started going to shows, and she was getting hammered. She couldn't win anything. So we actually ended up buying a dog out of the newspaper, and he was advertised as half a champion. And we bought him, and he was this big hairy red dog, and we had a professional handler groom him for us, but my dad showed him. And his very first show, he won the group first from the classes. And there was about 40 Irish setters in the breed ring that day. And my dad got a picture. And the next day he went fourth in the open dog class, and he got a picture again. So he didn't know what he was doing. But after that, we it just evolved from there. I started watching dogs, and I had a few heroes growing up. George Alston and Brian Taylor were both very prominent Irish setter handlers, and that's how I got the bug really. I got to watch George, and whenever I was in the States, I watched George. And whenever I was at home, I watched Brian Taylor, and they were both, I thought they were rock stars as far as I was concerned. I saw them, they had the most beautiful dogs. In my eyes, back then, Irish setters were the most beautiful dogs. So I started at that level, and my parents got to know a lot of the very big breeders. And there was a very famous breeder in Middleburg, Virginia, named Ted Eldridge. Travelled Irish setters. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that anymore. They're long gone, but they were very famous Irish setters. When I was about, I guess around 10, I went to visit Mr. Eldridge with my parents to look at a dog, and they ended up giving me an English cocker that Mrs. Eldridge bred. And after that, I started visiting them every year. I would go every year to Middleburg, Virginia, and I would do the, the what's this especially, it was the Potomac Irish Setter, especially in Virginia, and Old Dominion was my favorite show. I was the Cherry Blossom Circuit with Mr. Eldridge, and Mr. Eldridge's handlers back then were Mike Billings and George Alston. So I got to see my very first. I met Mike and Janie and Bob and Ted Young when I was like 10 years old. I met them at a Professional Handlers Association party with Mr. Eldridge, and I didn't know any of them except for George. So, but I think back now, and I got to meet some of the real icons of the sport when I was that age. So I went from there, and I showed dogs in Canada, and then I worked for handlers starting around 16 or 17. I worked for a handler named Gary McDonald. I worked for Brian Taylor, and I worked for Bobby Stebbins down there. And I hung out with, I bothered George all the time. I called him all the time. And I'm sure he was very nice about it, but I'm sure in his inside voice, he was saying, "What is this crazy Canadian kid doing?" But he would answer any question I had, and he still does. I talked to him last week. He still answers questions I have, and he's the one that actually taught me to teach people how to show dogs. I would go to his seminars, and he would teach me how to be a teacher. And it went from there. I went on my own probably in 1986. I went on my own because my boss at that point, Gary McDonald, he passed away tragically in a house fire. So the next weekend, I was the handler. I had to show the dogs, and it went from there. We showed an Irish setter named Impresario in '87, and he was top dog all breed, and I was 22 years old at that point, and it just kept coming from there. It seemed almost like it was written down somewhere. My career just kept catapulting till I ended up going to Best in Show at Westminster. And then after that, I kind of slowed down a bit and showed some dogs, and started actually lean more towards the teaching of it. So I enjoy teaching.
That's
That
amazing.
that's Cole's notes.
Wow. I mean, 22. I mean, a lot of people are just starting to have the dream,
I
for
know, it's
many.
crazy. I think back now. I have a 27-year-old son, and I think he's really mature. But when I was 22, I already had I was at 23. I had a mortgage, and I had this. It was crazy, you know.